Hey y'all, this is Dr. Nicole Richter here again to talk about philosophy and film by sharing with you some of the most important philosophical texts, at least in my opinion, related to the study of philosophy and film. And today I will continue with our reading on doing philosophy at the movies, which I read the preface to, and now we'll read the introduction. And this is a really good introduction because it basically really lays out what doing philosophy is, what it means, and why it's related to film studies. So it's a really good general primer on the use of philosophical thinking with regard to cinema. So this is the introduction from Doing Philosophy at the Movies by Richard Gilmore. Introduction: What it means to do philosophy. Wittgenstein at the movies and the uses of philosophy. In his memoir of his experiences with Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889 to 1951, Norman Malcolm tells how Wittgenstein, after teaching an especially demanding philosophy class at Cambridge University, would rush to a movie theater. He preferred Hollywood movies, musicals, westerns, and detective movies. He always sat in the very first row. I find this behavior especially striking because much of Wittgenstein's later philosophy, what appears in Philosophical Investigations, is somewhat ironically devoted to the problem of finding a way to stop doing philosophy. As Wittgenstein says in one of the central sections of Investigations, the real discovery is the one that makes me capable of stopping doing philosophy when I want to, the one that gives philosophy peace, so that it is no longer tormented by questions which bring itself into question. In the Investigations, Wittgenstein treats philosophy as a kind of sickness that a person needs to be cured of, and his later anti-philosophy philosophy is meant to be just such a cure. The sickness feels like a kind of anxious preoccupation with something that seems to desperately need resolving. Wittgenstein's diagnosis is that we are sick with worry about non-real problems. Wittgenstein's philosophical cure is to show us how what seems to be a philosophical problem, when looked at rightly, when looked at from the proper perspective, is not really the problem we thought it was. What he means to offer us is a kind of peace. What is ironic here is that Wittgenstein himself seems to have found a cure for his own philosophical illness that he never mentions in his book, namely, to go to popular Hollywood movies. Why would one of the 20th century's great philosophical geniuses be so attracted to what is commonly regarded as a kitschy non-art, such as Hollywood movies? It was certainly not because of lack of sophistication in the arts. Wittgenstein was raised in one of the wealthiest and most artistically sophisticated households in all of Europe. Brahms was a frequent house guest. Gustav Klimt painted a portrait of one of Wittgenstein's sisters. There were as many as 5 grand pianos in their house. One of Wittgenstein's brothers was a concert pianist. It was not a lack of exposure to sophisticated art that drew Wittgenstein to Hollywood movies. It is likely that it was partly just to escape from such sophisticated levels of aesthetics appreciation and the intellectual rigors of philosophical work that Wittgenstein went to the movies. There are many accounts of the great toll doing philosophical work and teaching philosophy took on him, but the case that I want to make here is that there was more in Wittgenstein's going to the movies than just escape, and that indeed there always is or can be if we go to the movies in a particular way. I hope to lay out what that particular way of going to the movies is, but the short answer to the question is to say that one can go philosophically. There is a long philosophical tradition of considering the relation of the individual to popular culture, and what it is about popular culture that makes it popular. For Plato and Aristotle, popular culture meant primarily poetry and theater. I will be primarily concerned with movies. There is an irony that runs through Plato's discussions of popular culture. In the Republic, he is very critical of popular art forms like poetry and theater, and yet he presents his ideas on these topics in the form of dialogues between various Athenian and Greek people. Plato writes his philosophical criticism of art in an extremely artistic form, a form that is both poetic and dramatic. There is in this ironic tension the seeds of a solution to the problem of how to regard popular culture. Plato's objection to popular art forms is that they appeal primarily to people's emotions instead of to people's intellect, the consequence of which is that their understanding of the world is formed by their emotions instead of their emotions being trained by their reason. Plato's problem with this is that emotions tend to be highly reactive and context-specific. They also tend to preempt choice. In the moment of experiencing an emotion, we do not have much choice about what emotion we are experiencing. Plato's fear is that the ideas people will form while in the grip of a momentary, involuntary emotion will be reactive rather than considered, context-specific rather than universal, and in general lacking in thoughtfulness. For Plato, the result of the intellect being subservient to the emotions is a degenerative ethical culture. Plato acknowledges the great power of popular art forms to influence people, and for that very reason endorses a strict form of government censorship on all popular art forms. The idea is that since people will not be able to choose rightly for themselves, since they will make their decisions based on the dictates of their emotions, instead of those of their reason, someone or some people who are able to make rational choices should choose for the rest of the people the themes and stories that will get expressed in popular cultural forms. Plato's call for governmental censorship of certain forms of potentially dangerous ideas, visual images, musical forms, or other popular cultural content is being echoed by many people today. There does seem to be some evidence to suggest that a high degree of exposure to, say, violent content on television or in movies can lead to negative, more violent behavior. Is the call for governmental censorship the solution here? Well, let's reconsider the case of Plato and see if a more complicated response may not be suggested. Constance Penley, in The Future of an Illusion, Film, Feminism, and Psychoanalysis, says, quote, "The shackled prisoners, fascinated by the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave, are the first cinema spectators. The only historical changes in the apparatus since then have been little more than technical modifications," end quote. This description seems strikingly true enough and uncannily highlights Plato's genius. It identifies him as a potential source for philosophical insights about the nature of going to the movies as well. Penley goes on to describe what Plato has done as having created a simulacrum of the psyche. Plato's allegorical goal in the Republic as a whole is to free people, probably not all people, but some who might be rulers, from the cave. Interestingly, one of his primary techniques for effecting this freedom seems to be through his dialogues, which are both poetic and dramatic, which is to say very cave-like. A way out of the cave would seem to be through the cave. Another way to say this might be to say that a way out of the cave is to use cave-like things, but to use them in the proper way. What then is the proper way? Well, it would seem to be to use them thoughtfully. The initial appeal might be the emotional attraction that such cave-like works may have for us, but ultimately escape from the cave can only come through a kind of transcendence of this emotional appeal. One must learn to regard them with some intellectual detachment and thoughtfulness. It is not that emotions themselves are bad. The philosopher who escapes from the cave may experience great joy. It is more that some emotional responses are less informed than others because some emotional responses are more purely reactive, making us as individuals more passive and less in control. In the Symposium, for example, Plato talks about erotic love. Erotic passion in its most initial form, when we are almost slavishly in its grip, is when we feel an erotic passion for another person's body. We must learn to be attracted to a person's mind or soul. But, and this is the important part, an attraction to another person's mind or soul will be a deeper and longer lasting pleasure, and so anyone who could choose would make that choice. For Plato, theater and music hit us so emotionally fast and hard that they can inhibit our developing the deeper understanding, the deeper appreciation, which gives us a choice. They will have a tendency, therefore, to keep us at the level of emotional development of teenagers, gaga for bodies and for the surface of things. Plato's allegory about escaping from the cave is really about transcending these initial, reactive, emotional responses to the surface of things. This notion of transcendence is central to Plato's whole conception. We have to be freed from the shackles of this worldliness in order to be able to transcend this worldliness and make our way out into the light of the real world, which, in the language of Plato's later metaphysics, means the realm of forms. A similar trajectory of experience is described in Aristotle's otherwise very different philosophy in the Poetics. In the Poetics, Aristotle describes, somewhat indirectly, a condition of shackledness, of retention and constraint, the remedy for which is a kind of purging, a catharsis. The notion of transcendence is a bit less explicit in Aristotle, but I think it can be usefully engaged. There is in Aristotle a similar notion of inhibited functioning and a way of gaining freedom from that condition. That freedom can be achieved, for Aristotle, through again the cave-like forms of drama, especially a tragic play. What I'm trying to suggest here is that in both Plato and Aristotle, from the earliest forms of Western philosophy, there is a notion of a needed escape from our quotidian ways of being, a way of being which is characterized by a kind of thraldom, and a thraldom that is characterized by an emotional investment that is somehow superficial and unhealthy. There are suggestions in both this escape can be achieved by means of an encounter with a dramatic art form. For both Plato and Aristotle, the escape is an escape from a condition that is intimately connected to our own emotional responses to things. Hence, the escape is an escape from some condition of ourself. It is an escape not just from, but also to a better condition of ourself. This better condition I will call being in a state of philosophical health. To remain healthy in this philosophical way will require a constant exercise of those parts of us that can contribute to our freedom from certain kinds of restraints. And one of the most effective modes of exercise for those parts of us can be engaging with dramatic works of art that have a kind of narrative structure, like movies. In the George Stevens movie Shane tells Marion, in response to Marion's concern about Shane's teaching her son Joey about shooting a pistol, Marion, a gun is just a tool, no better and no worse than any other tool. It is as good or as bad as the man who holds it. Again, I do not agree or endorse the gendered language in this essay, and it often comes up, so please keep that in mind. A similar idea underlies my way of coming to the movies. Movies are not safe or dangerous in themselves, but rather are more like tools that can be used well or poorly, for good or for ill. This comparison of movies to tools invoked Wittgenstein's idea in the Investigations that language is a tool and that various language games are like different tools in a toolbox. Each one is useful in its appropriate context and misused if used in an inappropriate context, as would be misuse of a screwdriver handle to hammer a nail with. Most of Wittgenstein's later philosophy is devoted to methods of ascertaining the appropriate contexts for different language games, which amounts to trying to figure out how to think in ways that are appropriate to the situations we are in. Our immense daily anxiety suggests that this is a real need. Wittgenstein thought of this as a philosophical sickness, one he attributed to a misunderstanding of what contexts are appropriate for a specific language game, and so is a kind of misuse of our tools. To speak of movies as tools implies the requirement of a certain amount of training in their appropriate uses, as well as correctives for those situations in which we may be tempted to misuse them. Against Plato, I advocate less censorship and more training in how to use the tools of popular culture to attain greater philosophical health. Philosophy is also a tool. If it is used properly, it can be used to great benefit, especially in bringing us peace from the anxieties that plague us. If it is misused, it can do considerable harm, i.e., increase those anxieties. Wittgenstein argues in the Investigations that there are many different purposes that philosophy can serve. Different contexts will require different kinds of philosophical methods to fix the philosophical errors we may be subject to in those contexts. I, however, want to identify a more singular underlying philosophical goal. If philosophy and movies can be usefully thought of as tools, then their appropriate uses will be determined by what we need to get done with them. We have many needs that both philosophy and movies can satisfy for us, but one need in particular, a need that is both essential and pressing, and which movies seem particularly well suited to address, is the need for lack of a better word, transport. By transport, I mean the need for a medium and a mechanism by which we may escape from our given condition, whatever that may be, and enter into a new condition. This new condition may be described as a new state of mind or a new perspective or a new mood. Wittgenstein needed to escape from the philosophical tangles that teaching his philosophy got him into. Other people may need to escape from anxieties and preoccupations about their own identities or about their jobs or their families or their economic concerns. A sense of this need for escape from one's present condition is nicely captured in a phrase by Stanley Cavell. Cavell is trying to account for why new artworks are continually being produced, why people keep trying to achieve some new understanding through art. They do this, Cavell says, quote, because what is known to be insufficient or worse, end quote. We all live, at least at some times in our lives, with a sense that there must be more to life than what we have. We often live with a persistent sense of disquiet, with the hope of some future possibility of an appeasement, of attaining some peace. To get that peace requires a kind of escape from where we are, since where we are often is not peaceful. Ideally, however, the escape is not just an escape from, but also an escape to. It is an escape from one state of mind, one state of being, to another. This transport from one state to another offers the possibility of growth. It is a possibility of an increase in the intensity in one's life, as well as an increase in one's understanding of the possibilities one's life contains. I say the possibility of growth because actual growth will require more than just the experience of transport. Certainly, people can go to the movies, be transported by or into the story of the movie, and leave with no more than a vague desire to do some violence, look fetishistically at women, or escape from work to go on some vague adventure. More is required to get the most from movies. It requires some kind of reflective acknowledgement of the experience of the transport, as well as just the experience of the transport itself. Movies are extremely good places, are extremely good tools for achieving this kind of transport. Philosophy is an extremely good tool for achieving the reflective acknowledgement that will yield the increase in understanding, intensity, and growth that make our lives more satisfying to us. In the preface to Contesting Tears, the Hollywood melodrama of the unknown woman, Stanley Cavell says, quote, the creation of film was as if meant for philosophy, meant to reorient everything philosophy has said about reality and its representation, about art and imitation, about greatness and conventionality, about judgment and pleasure, about skepticism and transcendence, about language and expression, end quote. What I understand Cavell to mean by this is that just as Plato conceived of a way of analogizing our interior mental space as external projection so that we could mentally visualize it and so come to a new understanding of it, movies have made this possibility a literal reality. This, in turn, has opened up new possibilities for philosophy. The fact of movies correlates with the fact of our vision of the world as we move through it. To examine our relation to movies works as an analog to our relation to our own minds. In movies, we find an objective correlative for all of our inner dramas of identity, of confidence in ourselves and in others, and the reliability of the world. And in this way, we can say that not only was film as if meant for philosophy, but that philosophy is also as if meant for film. What movies do to experiences, philosophy can do to movies. What movies do is weave a series of experiences into a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, the very stuff of good drama, according to Aristotle. What philosophy can do with a movie is to weave it into the fabric of our lives, which can also be described as the story of our lives. To have an experience itself involves, according to the great American philosopher John Dewey, just this kind of weaving. It involves something like the construction of a narrative. In Art as Experience, Dewey attempts to describe the trajectory, the basic pattern of all significant human experience. The central feature of our having an experience, according to Dewey, is that what we do, what happens to us, gets framed in or woven into a narrative account. In order to have an experience, a sequence of events in our life will have to acquire a kind of narrative form, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. As Dewey says, for life is no uniform, uninterrupted march or flow. It is a thing of histories, each with its own plot, its own inception and movement towards its close, each having its own particular rhythmic movement, each with its own unrepeated quality pervading it throughout. That is, an experience has a unity. What is most important for having an experience for Dewey is the notion of a consummation, a period of reflection after an experience in which the experience gets recognized as, is made into, an experience. This, for Dewey, is a creative process, an aesthetic process. Things are composed into an experience. Dewey refers to this process as reconstructive doing and as recognition, as opposed to passive perception. The result is a kind of felt harmony, a sense of integration. Dewey says the experience itself has a satisfying emotional quality because it possesses internal integration and fulfillment reached through ordered and organized movement. This sense of a felt harmony, of a satisfying sense of integration, correlates, it seems to me, with Wittgenstein's idea of giving philosophy peace. The goal is just a sense of satisfaction, of a felt harmony, and this is achieved when we can recognize, can construct a narrative pattern around the events of our lives. I think this whole idea is best captured in an extended passage from Dewey's Art as Experience. Dewey says, quote, "Life itself consists of phases in which the organism falls out of step with the march of surrounding things, and then recovers unison with it either through effort or by some happy chance. And in a growing life, the recovery is never mere return to a prior state, for it is enriched by the state of disparity and resistance through which it has successfully passed. If the gap between organism and environment is too wide, the creature dies. If its activity is not enhanced by the temporary alienation, it merely subsists. Life grows when a temporary falling out is a transition to a more extensive balance of the energies of the organism with those of the conditions under which it lives." End quote. I see Wittgenstein's idea of giving philosophy peace, as well as Dewey's idea of an experience, as aiming at the same thing, the personal, individual growth that results in a sense of a more extensive balance of the energies of the organism. This balance of energies is what I mean by philosophical health. When we feel this balance of energies, the sense of insecurity is eased and is replaced by a sense of confidence in our own purpose, in our ability to act, and in the sense of having a place from which to act. For Dewey, the recovery of this balance of energies comes from our being able to effectively recognize the narrative structure of our lives. Art, for Dewey, is just a specialized version of this general activity of giving meaning to our lives. My idea is that there is perhaps no better place for practicing this activity of recognizing narrative patterns than at the movies. Noel Carroll, in his very interesting essay, The Power of Movies, identifies a particular model of narrative form that is especially characteristic of movies. He calls it the Aerotechtic model of narrative. He describes this as a question-answer model in which later scenes of a movie answer questions raised by events that occurred earlier in the movie. This Aerotechtic model makes of movies a kind of game, a game of finding the answers to the earlier asked questions. Another way to describe this game would be to say that this is a game of connecting the pieces of the film into a unified whole, which is just the activity that makes an experience for Dewey, and which yields the sense of a felt harmony and the sense of peace that we have been looking for. The primary enemies of experience for Dewey are those things which interfere with our abilities to see the relations between events that happen to us. They obscure the connecting pattern that unifies an experience for us. He says, for example, zeal for doing, lust for action, leaves many a person, especially in this hurried and impatient human environment in which we live, with experience of an almost incredible paucity, all on the surface. No one experience has a chance to complete itself because something else is entered upon so speedily. The frenetic drive to be active, so characteristic of us as Americans, inhibits our ability to have meaningful experiences because it interferes with the period of reflection in which our experiences become unified, in which we weave the narrative of events into a meaningful unified whole. If the essence of philosophy is reflection, philosophy can contribute to the completion of the experience of certain movies as we engage in philosophical reflection on them. Thinking philosophically, reflectively about movies can contribute to the sense of depth and importance of the movies that people see, which would help to contribute to the sense of depth and importance to the sense of meaning in our lives as a whole. When we think about movies philosophically, the best part of going to the movies becomes the time after the movie, when you get a chance to talk about the movie over a cup of coffee or a beer or a glass of wine. If movies are seen as tools to be used in reconfiguring our lives to make our lives more intense and more satisfying, then the ways in which a movie can be used, what is good or bad or interesting or dangerous in the movie, is exactly the conversation to have. If we can talk about the sexism, the violence, the gratuitous versus the meaningful sexual encounters, the nobility of some character, or the ethical choices faced by another character, then we are no longer in a position of passively having the values represented in the movie shape our character, but rather we are in the position of recognizing and acknowledging those forces and adjudicating for ourselves how we should regard them within the context of our own lives. This process is not just empowering, but also pleasurable. The conversation can be as easily about James Cameron's The Terminator as about Renoir's The Rules of the Game, and as usefully too. Doing this, we narrativize the themes of the film into the context of our own lives, rather than having our lives narrativized by what we see in the movies. The movies then become tools for improving, empowering, and liberating our lives, rather than oppressive or manipulating forces that corrupt our lives by making us more violent, solipsistic, or fetishistic in our relationships with other people. Richard Rorty calls this idea of narrativizing redescription. Working from a Nietzschean perspective, Rorty sees such redescriptions as essential to being fully oneself, to being fully a self. To fail to narrativize one's own life, to fail to redescribe oneself, Rorty suggests, is to fail to be fully human. As Rorty says, quote, to fail as a poet, and thus for Nietzsche, to fail as a human being, is to accept somebody else's description of oneself, to execute a previously prepared program, to write, at most, elegant variations on previously written poems. So the only way to trace home the causes of one's being as one is would be to tell a story about one's causes in a new language. I read this to be saying something like, either you redescribe your own life or someone will redescribe it for you. I want to say, go to movies and redescribe them in terms of the context of your own life, or else they will redescribe your life in their terms. To be prepared to redescribe movies in terms of one's own life, one's own truths, is to go to the movies philosophically. I agree with many of the cultural critics and politicians today who say that movies can be a terrible influence on people, but I disagree that that is the fault of the movies. What is called for is a re-education in how to go to the movies. The way to go to the movies is to go philosophically. The trajectory of philosophy. There is a specific pattern of philosophical thought with which I am primarily concerned. It is the pattern that is followed in the process of discovery. It is the pattern that is followed in creativity. It is the pattern that underlies the experience of meaningfulness. It is the pattern that is experienced in growth. There are various philosophical concepts that identify this pattern. In aesthetics, the experience of the beautiful and of the sublime are about the experience of this pattern. Hegel's notion of the logic of thesis, antithesis, synthesis is about this pattern. The description of God's creation of the universe in the Kabbalah, the Zimzum, is about this pattern. Simone de Beauvoir's description of allowing disclosure is about this pattern. Wittgenstein's notion of seeing as involves this pattern. The proto-philosophers escaping from Plato's cave follow this pattern. Descartes' discovery of the cogito follows this pattern. John Rawls' invention of the veil of ignorance as a means for arriving at a just political system follows this pattern. In the chapters that follow, I offer philosophical readings of popular films. Each of these readings is concerned with different philosophical topics and makes appeals to the works of different philosophers. However, there is really a single overarching trajectory with which I am concerned, and I take this to be the trajectory of philosophy. I take it that it is controversial to say that there is a trajectory of philosophy, but that it is less controversial to say that philosophy is about reasoning. The great and underappreciated American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce describes reasoning in his essay, The Fixation of Belief, in the following way, quote, "The object of reasoning is to find out, from the consideration of what we already know, something else we do not know." Already in this brief description of reasoning, it suggested a larger universal trajectory for thought in general. Thought will be initiated by the sense of a need to know something that we do not know. There will be a process starting with what we already know of trying to figure out what we do not know. The conclusion of this process, if we are successful, is an insight, a seeing of a connection that we had not seen before, that will be experienced as a discovery. We will know something new. Peirce describes this trajectory in the following way, quote, "The irritation of doubt causes a struggle to attain a state of belief. I shall call this struggle inquiry. Thinking is about trying to understand things. It is an attempt to move from a place of confusion and doubt to a place of understanding and of knowing what to do. This is the narrative of virtually every film that has ever been made. A protagonist moves from a condition of relative peace and contentment into a condition of doubt and conflict. The movie is about how the protagonist goes about trying to remove the doubt and conflict and to figure out what to do. The action of a movie is, one might say, externalized thought. To see the action of a movie as an externalized performance of an inner drama, of an interior exploration of ideas and possibilities, brings out not just the philosophical aspects of movies, but their aesthetic aspects as well. To see Tom Cruise as Ethan Hunt in John Woo's Mission Impossible 2 kick into the air a pistol buried in the sand and simultaneously, or at least in an instant and in slow motion, spin, grab the gun, dive, and fire in midair is to watch a kind of visual jazz. It is like MacGyver on speed. When I was working in construction, people used to say, "We'll have to MacGyver it." To MacGyver it just meant to figure out a solution to an unanticipated problem using whatever materials happened to be on the job site at the time. Of course, that is what all of our thinking is like. We are MacGyvering it every day. Every time we encounter some new unanticipated difficulty that we need to solve to get on with our lives. We MacGyver it at work. We MacGyver it in our relationships, with our family and friends. We MacGyver it when we get lost driving. Love is all about MacGyvering it. The thing about MacGyver was that he was really good at seeing the possibilities in a situation. And the same can be said for the character of Ethan Hunt in Mission Impossible 2. That kind of skill takes practice. It takes training and work. One has to be an excellent musician to be a competent jazz player. What I want to say is that to MacGyver it is just to think, but thinking itself takes some work, takes some will, takes some practice. To think is what it means to reason and to do inquiry. To do inquiry is to do philosophy. There is a kind of philosophy that is done in the towers of academia, and there is a type of philosophy that is done in the streets every day. My contention is that while some of the subjects of these inquiries may be different, the basic trajectory, the basic pattern of thought, in both cases is the same. And a good place to learn about this trajectory, to learn about the fruits of discovery that this trajectory can yield, and to practice getting better at it, is at the movies. To go to the movies philosophically is to become a protagonist oneself. It is to be sensitive to and to acknowledge certain mysteries, certain difficulties raised by a movie that cause irritation of doubt. One must work with what one already knows, but also search for additional clues. Be alert to the suggestion of as yet unperceived relationships. It involves seeing new connections between the characters in the movie, between the different parts of the plot of the movie, and between what happens in the movie and what happens in the world and in our own lives. Sometimes this will require a certain amount of attentive patience to see where things are heading. It will take some educated guesswork to anticipate where things are going. Like when Leonard Shelby in Memento is running along and wondering why he might be chasing this other man, only to discover, no whoops, that this other man is chasing him. A whole new set of imperatives suddenly get engaged. Movies explore this trajectory narratively, while philosophy has approached the same trajectory more abstractly and conceptually. My goal is to combine these two ways of doing the same thing in order to have each augment the possibilities for discovery in the other. What is generated by this process, by undergoing this trajectory, at least when it is successful, is what I call meaning. An experience is meaningful when it comes to a kind of conclusion and we have learned something from it that we can use, something that will help us get on in the world. This experience is, I believe, one of the most deeply human and most deeply satisfying that we can have. It is the experience of growth. There is always more to learn in the process of our ongoing lives, in this evolving world, which is to say that there is always more meaning than can be incorporated into our lives. This is the core idea of American pragmatism. It is a hopeful and optimistic philosophy, and this hope and optimism is empirically verified again and again. Every time that we successfully negotiate a new situation or successfully deal with an unexpected encounter testifies to our powers of recovery, to our power to discover new solutions and to gain new understanding. The theme of discovering our untapped, unsuspected powers is also recurrent in Hollywood movies, from The Wizard of Oz to Unbreakable or The Matrix. This philosophy, however, is not without its tragic side. The very fact that more meaning can always be discovered implies that at any given moment we live surrounded by a darkness of which we are only dimly aware, that our understanding is always only partial, that there is always more to know, that there is always a mystery that has not been solved. This is the abyss of the American sublime. It is the vaguely horrifying, vague because so dimly perceived, underside that haunts our American optimism. It is the undercurrent of anxiety that nags even our greatest successes. This is also a theme of some of the best Hollywood movies, such as Citizen Kane or Vertigo or Taxi Driver or Fargo. It is also a theme that underlies, or at least contributes to, the fascination with horror movies, which play on the vague dread that there is something lurking beyond the realm of our understanding. This is as true of Romero's Night of the Living Dead as of David Lynch's Lost Highway. Finally, I just want to make a few initial remarks about interpretation, a question I will return to in the conclusion. In an essay called Against Interpretation, Susan Sontag attacks a kind of interpretation that is static and deadening to art. It is the kind of interpretation that works from a kind of template, whether a Freudian or a Jungian or an evolutionary biology template, for example, and by a process of reduction, by the elimination of all details irrelevant to that template or lens, comes up with a kind of replacement narrative. X stands for Y, Z for A, so that the resultant interpretation will conclude that some particular movie, say a heist movie, is really about sons wanting to kill their fathers and marry their mothers, or about the oppression of the people by capitalist forces. I believe that all seeing is interpretive, that there is no non-interpretive seeing. I also believe that there are better interpretations and worse ones. Reductive interpretations may have a function, but it is a narrow one. As Peirce says, we always have to approach what we do not know, do not understand, with what we do know and do understand. This is just to interpret. For me, a good interpretation does not mean that one has divined what the director or writer was really thinking, although I think what the creators of art were really thinking is relevant. For me, there really is something like wisdom, and so something like progress toward wisdom. The evidence for this, for me, is my sense of my own lack of wisdom in my earlier selves. I feel like I really do understand more now than I did, so I see more now than I did. A good interpretation for me is one that leads in the direction of wisdom, that leads a person to see more. Sontag, in her opposition to the reductive, all-too-knowing kind of interpretation, calls for an erotics of art. I take her to mean that she wants to see a way of reading artworks, say movies, that does not reduce art, but which makes it more complex, more subtle, more ambiguously rich. I understand her to mean that she is not opposed to all forms of interpretation, but just to interpretations of a certain sort. The kind of interpretation of which I take it that she would approve is an interpretation that works the way a healthy love relationship works. A healthy love relationship works to embrace the other in their otherness, to allow the other to be as they are, and to grow into whatever they will be, whatever they will grow into. It involves the attitude of respect and appreciation rather than the attempt to dominate, control, define, and oppress. A healthy relationship also demands a clear vision of the other, not just a projection of what one would like the other to be. There are all sorts of tools one can use to help one to see more clearly. There are glasses, for example, and books of psychology and philosophy that can be powerful aids to sight. Like any tool, as Shane says, they can be misused, but they can also be well used. A tool is best used when used, as it were, with love. It is to this that I aspire in my own interpretations of movies that I love. I aspire to an erotics of interpretation. Thank you.